might want to save the applause for after the presentation, because you might think it's not that good. Right, I want to talk to you about the BBC today and the work we created for them. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction. You probably all know the BBC from BBC World Service or BBC.com. And you all probably think of the BBC as a broadcaster, as a TV station. Let me tell you one thing. TV broadcasting is only a small part of what the BBC does today. The BBC is a content provider. Not only do they do original programming, such as documentaries, dramas, game shows, etc., they do way beyond more. They have news, they have sports, but also they actually put technical standards in place. The BBC was one of the first companies that actually created content on demand with the BBC iPlayer. Today, if you want to sell a TV set, a TV monitor in the UK, your TV set has to comply with the technical standards of the iPlayer. So the BBC puts standards in place. It also puts standards in place in terms of content. The BBC is a pinnacle of quality. It is unbiased. But what is even more impressive about the BBC is that it is all a public service. The BBC does technological inventions, and they patent the inventions, and they release the patents so that everyone can use them. This is simply to prevent greedy corporations to get their greedy fingers on technology to extract money from you. The BBC is one of the most wonderful organizations on this planet, let me tell you that. I think that deserves an applause, by the way. Thank you. Now, we had the great fortune to work with the BBC and create a new typeface family. About 20 years ago, design consultancy Lambinaire created a new identity for the BBC, and part of the identity was to introduce Gill Sans in all its visual appearance as part of the typographic system. Gill Sans was used in broadcasting, it was used for print production, etc. But of course online it is only partially used, and online it's Arial as a default for certain systems and Helvetica. Problem is that today, with the demands that the BBC has in terms of broadcasting, in terms of content delivery, those two typefaces simply do not do the trick anymore. For one, they don't do the trick anymore aesthetically, but secondly, they don't do it technologically anymore. They simply do not do the trick anymore in regards to accessibility. So, we were, I say, invited after a three-way pitch to work with the BBC on this wonderful project. The entire project was led by BBC GEL, Global Experience Language. This is a unit within the BBC that is now centralizing the way the BBC does graphic design in all its output forms, be that on the web, be that on the app, be that on the TV screen, be that in print, it doesn't matter. Anywhere that the BBC has a visual output, BBC GEL has had a controlling input. For BBC GEL, they realized that, as I said before, the typography simply didn't do the trick anymore, so they commissioned us to design a typeface. I want to talk to you a little bit about the process of how we went about designing this font. Now, generally, before we work with any client, we always do a workshop with all the stakeholders within the organization. Now, you can imagine that the BBC is a bit different in that respect. The sheer size and the sheer diversity of the organization meant that there was about 20 different stakeholders involved, 20 people with 20 different requirements. So we needed to bring them all together into one room for a workshop to align everyone's expectations, but also to align everyone's requirements. We had to do workshops where we talked about hopes and fears. This is one of the most important things. You can't just go off and design something. Even if you know what the technical requirements are, you need to understand how people think. You need to understand what they want to get out of the project. And you also need to understand what they're really, really scared of. So we do an exercise with people called hopes and fears, where we get them on post-it notes, we get them to write down what they think, what they want, what they're scared of. So green, all the hopes, red, all the fears. We put them all on the board, and then everyone gets to talk about it. It's a little bit of a therapy session, you know, I admit, but it is actually incredibly insightful, and it creates a dialogue between the various stakeholders. And you have to understand that stakeholders are not only designers or marketing people, they can also be IT people, and the IT guy has definitely different hopes and fears. And you want to get the IT guy on your side. If the IT guy hates you, there is no chance that your fonts are ever going to be delivered. Yeah. IT guy, keep him nice. So we had these hopes and fears, and a few things crystallized out of this. You know, for example, unity and modernization. Helvetica and Gill Sans did not convey modern. So they conveyed a sense of like something from the last century. By the last century, I mean before 2000. Or fit for all BBC audiences. You have to understand that the BBC has probably the widest possible user audience of all organizations in this world. The BBC is being watched by 3-year-olds and by 103-year-olds. Everyone has to have access to the content. A fear is that it is not flexible enough, what we're doing, or that it isn't future-proof. Again, if you work with an organization like the BBC, whatever you produce has to be fit for the next 20 years, because the size of the organization means that they cannot just replace it in 4 years' time. It's too big, too much of an effort. Now, the next thing that was really important for us to understand, but also for the stakeholders in the BBC to understand, is what is British? Now, the BBC is a British company. It doesn't get any more British than the BBC. So we need to find out what is British. And for that, we did an exercise with images. Images from around Britain. Images of what we perceive to be British. So again, this was a workshop exercise with all the stakeholders involved. And then we got them to take typefaces and put the typefaces with the images. Now, if I just go back and we have a look at the bottom right, that's obviously Burberry. You know, so with Burberry, we're going to get our old friend Comic Sans and everything that is associated with not Comic Sans, Comic Sans. What am I talking about? Gill Sans. You know, there's maybe a Freudian slip here, but everything that is associated with Gill, Eric Gill, or in the middle on the right we have the British Museum. You know, so therefore we're associating Lindisfarne Gospels or something like that. That's kind of like old knowledge. So we did a whole series of images where typefaces were associated with the images, and that gives us an understanding of what it means to be British, of what it means, that Britishness. Just an emotional feeling. And it also allows everyone to start thinking in the same way. Then we do an exercise on perceptual mapping. For this exercise, we draw up grids, and usually on the horizontal and the vertical line, we have adjectives, and they tend to be opposing. Opposing not in the sense of positive and negative, but just opposing. So we have maybe 3 or 4 different perceptual maps. And then we split up the stakeholders into groups, and we get them to place cards with typefaces in a particular area of that perceptual map. That gives us an indication how people perceive certain type styles. And it is much better to do it this way, in a visual way, than actually talk about it. Because it's very, very difficult sometimes to put emotions into words. It's much easier if you have something and say, this roughly expresses what I'm thinking of. And then everyone can follow it and understand it. And everyone can be aligned. So we had a group of typefaces in that top left corner where the stakeholders wanted the new typeface to be in terms of emotions, in terms of perceptions. And interestingly enough, 3 of them crystallized out. 3 of them ticked the boxes for Britishness and ticked the boxes that they felt they wanted to associate it with. And interestingly enough, they're all British typefaces or designed by British typeface designers. So clearly the exercises that we did before the perceptual mapping already had an impact, already aligned everyone's thinking and got everyone talking to each other. Now, with all this information then at hand and available, we went away and started sketching. Pretty much the entire design studio was actually involved in the process, about 24 designers, everyone got to have a go interpreting the information that we got out of the workshop. And everyone provided sketches. Now these were done in the course of a day, very quickly, just capturing a look and feel, capturing an essence of the Britishness of what the typeface should look like. At this stage, it's also important to say that from the beginning, we decided, or from the beginning, we suggested that the BBC should have a sans and a serif font family, a type system that allowed them to use the font family quite flexibly, because we didn't want them, or BBC Gel doesn't want the BBC to license new fonts and to license other fonts and thus dilute the brand of the BBC. They want to work within a singular type system. It also allows them, from that type system, the existing one, to expand with new styles. Maybe a condensed, maybe a soft, rounded, curly version for the children's, and so on and so forth. It also allowed them actually with the sans and the serif to be quite flexible and display content according to outlet. The BBC News wants to look different, say from the BBC Sport or from BBC Children. We presented 7 design concepts or 7 ideations, sketches, in both a sans and a serif, and the 3 highlighted were to be taken further. All 3 of these designs, sans and serif, we then expanded into a range of weights. These decisions have to be made very early on, because quite often you find that the extreme weights take on a different expression than the middle weights. And it was clear in this system as well that the 2 middle weights, the regular and the bold, were the workhorses of the typeface. They had to do the hard work of body copy reading, be in the sans as well as in the serif. The more extreme weights, they could have a little bit more expression. They could be used more in a display environment to be a little bit punchier from that point of view. The typefaces, those design concepts, were in a full English character set across all the weights. I mean, fairly rough. They were obviously not detailed at all, but in a full English character set to allow the BBC to implement and test the design concepts in collateral, on apps, on the website, in print, and so on and so forth. And from that, they were able to actually make decisions fairly quickly. In the design concepts, we also very early on started looking at the non-Latins. The BBC obviously provides content across the world. One of the largest user bases in terms of non-Latins is the Arabic scripts, so Arabic, Farsi, and Urdu. Devanagari for the Indian market, also a very large market for the BBC. So from the start, in these design concepts, we were including the non-Latins to see how the design decisions in the Latin transferred into the non-Latins, but also to gain information from the non-Latins. What can we take from stroke modulations, from proportions? What can we take across back into the Latin to make it more expressive, to make it more BBC, to give it more personality? So we had these 3 design concepts, and from that was reduced to 2 design concepts, which were then refined even further. This was a process where we really went into quite some detail, again, across the entire English character set. We had to consider little things like, for example, the Q-tail. The Q-tail cannot descend below the baseline. That was a technical requirement because the BBC has a news ticker that goes across the bottom of the screen, and it's in all caps. And if you have a descending character, that breaks that news ticker. So we had to find a design solution for the Q-tail that it works in that news ticker, but it also has correct aesthetic expression. If you look at some of the details, I mean, here we're talking about really super fine details, but if you look at the differences between option 2A and option 2B, you can see the G, for example, has, in the 2B version, is kind of like a little bit more modern. Is that the word? I don't know. If you compare 4A and 4B, you find that 4A is rounder, is softer, whereas 4B has a more square expression as well. So these were requirements by the BBC. They wanted to explore those 2 design concepts a little bit further with those details to really be able to catch exactly the requirements, the Britishness, the modernity that the typeface should have. Eventually, option 2B was where everyone decided. And again, this was done in a workshop with all the 20 stakeholders involved. We had all the typefaces stuck up on the wall in collateral, so you can actually make a decision on how it will look when it is being used. And we gave everyone red stickers, and they had to put the stickers on the typefaces, which they favored most. So it's kind of like a majority, a very democratic process, a majority process, but the reality was that with the exception of one person, everyone went for 2B. And in the end, we even got that last person to put their sticker on 2B as well. So that's success. So let's just quickly compare the final 2B version with the original design concept 2. And again, the Q-tail obviously has changed. You can see there's a tail on the A. Again, that is a little bit reminiscent to Gill Sans. It's got that kind of British antique kind of feel. The G, obviously, with the non-spur top. And the L has a spur as well at the bottom, and that helps with legibility. So, one big thing that the BBC is going on about is accessibility. As I said before, the BBC has to be accessible from 3 years old to 103 years old. The typeface had to be at least as legible as Helvetica. Now, personally, I think that's a fairly easy job to do, but you have to be aware of that. You have to be aware that there's people with visual impairments watching the TV or reading the website. So you have to think of these people. You have to be aware that children, learner readers, will access the BBC website and want to read the typeface. So accessibility is a big, big deal. The BBC has an entire department that is devoted to accessibility. They have a tick box list, and you have to satisfy all those requirements, whether that is a typeface or a website, it doesn't matter. So let's talk a little bit about what we do to make a typeface accessible. And before we actually talk about the typeface details, I just want to kind of like discuss with you the brain. Now, let's get one thing clear. We do not read on the page. We do not read with our eyes. Reading happens in your brain. And by the way, take care of your brain. It's probably your most valuable asset that you have your entire life. The brain is phenomenal. So reading happens in the brain. And reading happens in one specific part of the brain, where the red dot is, in the visual word form area. This particular part of the brain, which is right about here, and is the size of the tip of your finger, decodes every single letter irrespective of language or writing system. But make no mistake, you are not born with the ability to read. You have to learn to read and you have to practice. If you don't practice, you get bad at reading. You have to practice it. It's important. But we as typographers can help the reading process. And we can help the visual word form area decode characters. For example, make sure that when you choose a typeface for accessibility, that the letter forms are not ambiguous. The letter forms are distinct from one another. Coming back to Comic Sans, there is actually a reason why people like Comic Sans. It's because, for one, it's soft and cuddly, but also the letter forms are very distinct from one another. So it's quite easy for the brain to decode the individual characters and put them together into words. But Comic Sans is obviously not appropriate in an environment like the BBC when you have a news website that talks about the latest tsunami. That would be a little bit bad, you know. So you need to have a more serious typeface. But you can design a typeface that aids in the process of decoding letter forms. So ambiguity is very important. Part of ambiguity is also creating open letter shapes. If you think of Helvetica, as we have at the top, you find that for one, all the proportions are very similar to one another, but the letter forms are closed in, creating a lot of ambiguity. If you open the letter forms, you make more distinct forms, again, aiding the process of decoding in the brain. Another thing is spacing. I know you guys have this option in InDesign to minus track typefaces, and we're talking about this, we're talking about text fonts now. You have this option of minus tracking typefaces. Don't! Just don't. Leave it alone, because your type designer, your friendly type designer, actually knows how to space a typeface. Yeah? Don't make it tighter. The tighter you make it, you create more visual crowding. The letters come closer together. It is more difficult for your visual word form area to identify the individual characters and to correctly and quickly decode them. And also, tight letter spacing just looks shit. There is no other way to say it. It's not good. It's not a good idea. Never. Also, make sure that, particularly when you're in a digital environment, make sure that your stroke weights are robust. There's nothing worse than on a website or in an app having a light or a thin typeface. I am 55 years old. Do not give me a light typeface, black or gray on a white background. I can't see it. Yeah? You're totally missing your target. Make robust stroke weights. Again, it helps with the identification of the individual letter forms. And lastly, make sure your X heights are reasonably tall. And this is important for a digital environment because you only have a limited number of pixels available. And particularly in an environment like the BBC, which goes global, you do not know what output device the person is looking at. That person that looking at your font may actually look at it on a 96 dpi black and white screen. You do not know that. You have no control over it. So you need to facilitate as good a representation of the characters as possible. And having a larger X height allows you to do that. So, wreath. I just want to introduce now the complete font family. We've worked with the BBC for about a year on that, and Wreath was launched in August with BBC Sports, and I'll show a few samples in a minute. The biggest part of creating this font family was actually identifying what the design should look like, identifying what the expression is. Once we had everyone aligned, and once everyone understood the same thing about where the design is going, the execution was actually fairly quick. So the typeface family today consists of 22 font styles. The condensed was added on request of BBC Sports. We're expecting the font family to grow over the years as more and more departments take on the font family. So let's have a quick look at the sans and how it relates to the serif. You can see they come from the same mold. Proportions are not dissimilar to one another, and certain design details, are kept as well, although they differ slightly, of course, to fit the purpose. But how shall I describe it? They're not brothers and sisters, they're more like cousins to one another. They have a family resemblance, but they can work independently, and they both have their own personality, but that also makes them extremely flexible and mixable and create quite a nice expression. This is the character set as we have it at present, so it covers Eastern and Western European languages as well as Cyrillic. Now, the Cyrillic was done in this first stage because actually Russia is quite a big and important market for the BBC as well. We're expecting over the years to expand the character set, particularly with the Arabic script as well as Devanagari. The typeface contains small caps and some other typographical niceties. And alternative characters, for example, such as the single story A for a more children-oriented context. I just want to give you a couple examples about the rollout and the implementation. Again, the BBC is a huge beast. It's hugely diverse, with hugely diverse needs. So the implementation is expected to take about 18 to 24 months to be completed across the entire organization. BBC Sports has launched it, as I said, back in August. And it is expected that BBC Weather and BBC News are going to take it on very soon as well. Now, News, Weather and Sports are the three flagship companies of the BBC. Whatever those three do, everyone else will do eventually as well. So once you have those on board, you're okay with the BBC. So you can see the Premier League table, Doshi. It is not the Premier League font, it's the BBC font.
Maybe other channels?
Yeah, well, we don't look at other channels. The BBC is everything. Who cares about the others? And just a couple more examples. It is actually live on the apps, on the websites and everything, and you see it on the TV. So if you go on to bbc.com and you go on the sports website, you can see it live there. It's looking really, really beautiful. Now, let me just talk very briefly about how we got to the name Wreath. It is in honor of Lord Wreath, who in the 1920s founded the BBC, very much on the principle that it is a public institution for the public good. From the moment it was founded like that until today, nearly 100 years later, the BBC in its philosophy has hardly changed. It provides unbiased content, unbiased news of highest quality. It provides drama, documentaries of highest quality. That was created on the outset. And I think to call the font Wreath, BBC Wreath, is a very fitting name for a visionary who in the 1920s actually set the foundation for something that is a guiding light in today's jungle of fake news, of weird and impenetrable media, 140 characters on Twitter. So, thank you very much.